When we're representing historical periods in modern media, such as video games, movies, TV shows, we have a tendency to supplant our modern sentiments and our modern world and outlook on things, and even politics in some cases, onto historical periods. And obviously, this might fit a modern audience, but it doesn't always represent historical periods very well. Something I've noticed recently is the question of social hierarchy, and I've been reading The Three Musketeers, and I want to share something with you here. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So, I've been reading The Three Musketeers recently, and I've also been watching reviews and even being part of one you will have seen if you look at IGN for the new game Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. And there's been some controversy around this game, which I'm not going to get into on this channel, but it did raise the interesting topic of social roles, social hierarchy. Now, something I've noticed watching and reading a lot of modern media set in historical periods is that a lot of modern video games, TV shows, things like this, struggle to show social hierarchy. Now, I understand that where you're watching this from in the world, you may have slightly more apparent or slightly less apparent social hierarchy. A comparison that people often make, for example, is between the UK and the USA. And it should be noted, I think that generally speaking, people in the UK are a little bit more aware of social classes, working class, lower middle class, upper middle class, upper class, the landed gentry, lords, we've got monarchy and everything else like this. Whereas obviously in America, after the revolution, this more or less ceased to be a thing, although some people would agree that there is some degree of political and economic aristocracy anyway, but that's far outside the scope of this channel. Anyway, one of the things that sometimes bugs me is when modern creators of media, whether it's games or movies or whatever, put a little bit too much of the modern world into a historical period. Now, this can serve a purpose, and obviously if it's a fantasy environment, then who cares? And I do understand, at the end of the day, this is entertainment for modern people. So modern people want to feel represented and part of the thing that they are watching or playing or whatever else. We're not going to get into that. Instead, I'm going to purely look at a historical source. But here's the complication. It is a 19th century source, Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers, writing about the 17th century. So we've got three layers here. First of all, we've got it set in the 17th century, and the 17th century was full of servants and slaves and really, really poor working class people. There were some middle class, mercantile, sort of up and coming people. And there were, of course, landed gentry, aristocracies, monarchy, empires, everything else. Okay, so a very broad social spectrum. By the 19th century, we could probably argue that to some extent, certainly in France, where it's set, this had narrowed somewhat. Okay, there was no longer slavery, for example, but there were still servants. But nevertheless, he was very well historically researched, I would say, for a 19th century author. And so he was trying to set his novel, written in the 19th century, very much in the context of the 17th century. But then, fast forward, we get to the 20th century and the inventions of movies and then TV shows, and you and I, most of what we grew up knowing about the Three Musketeers. I grew up watching D'Artagnan and the Muskehounds. How many of you watched that? So probably my first contact with this tale, with this story, was through a cartoon. So in the 1980s. So many of you will think of the Three Musketeers in the light of late 20th century, probably for the most part, and even 21st century renditions of it. You know, the BBC did a completely, massively diverged from the original story version, although it's quite an enjoyable show. So, regardless of how you came into the Three Musketeers, what you probably haven't done, at least initially, is looked at the 17th century period. Now, what's interesting is Alexandre Dumas did try to represent this. So, first of all, in the 17th century in France, there was, as I've said, a vastly wide social spectrum, including slaves and including servants who were while they were technically free, were in some cases pretty close to slavery in some cases, and some slaves were quite well looked after. So we're not getting into the subject of slavery. But what is interesting is this exchange. So I'm going to read to you an exchange from The Three Musketeers. It's in the second half. It's about 2/3 of the way through the book. And it's where D'Artagnan and the rest of the Musketeers are tasking Planchet with taking information to England. Okay. Initially, they're talking about a letter. And should this letter be intercepted and caught, or should Planchet be tortured and forced to talk and give information up, then D'Artagnan's life would be at risk, and potentially lots of other people who they were trying to protect. So we're going to look at how they communicate, how these musketeers communicate with Planchet. But just very briefly before we do, I want to mention the ages of them, because I think many people don't know this because they've only watched the movies or the TV shows. So at this point, the musketeers are supposed to range in age from about 23 to about 28. So they're all in their 20s. Planchet, who in various versions of the movie and film has been represented as kind of older, is actually he's described as a lad, as a boy. So my interpretation is he's supposed to be younger than the musketeers. So he's not the version that you might know from the David Lester versions in the 1970s of a kind of middle-aged man. He's actually supposed to be, I would say, probably late teens, early 20s. So he's, by modern versions, practically modern eyes, practically a kid. And he is a kind of a working class servant. And before I read this as well, just to mention, all of the musketeers have servants, and in the original book, and I recommend you read the original by Alexandre Dumas, or listen to it on Audible, for example. The servants play a massive role in the story and are omnipresent. The servants are there all the time, and every single major character, or basically every character who isn't themselves a servant in the book, has servants, at least one. So servants, like most of the population, were either farmers or servants, as far as I can tell, in the 17th century, and certainly in this book. Anyway, let's look at this exchange. Planchet was sent for and instructions were given him. The matter had been named to him by D'Artagnan, who in the first place pointed out the money to him, and then the glory, and then the danger. "I will carry the letter in the lining of my coat," said Planchet, "and if I'm taken, I'll swallow it." "Ah, well, but then you will not be able to fulfill your commission," said D'Artagnan. "Ah, you will give me a copy this evening, which I shall know by heart tomorrow." D'Artagnan looked at his friends as if to say, "Well, what did I tell you?" So he's, saying he's good. You can rely on my servant here. "Now," he continued, addressing Planchet, "you have 8 days to get an interview with Lord de Winter." That's Milady de Winter's brother, who isn't portrayed in lots of the movies. "You have 8 days to return, in all 16 days. If on the 16th day after your departure at 8 o'clock in the evening you're not here, no money, even if you're just 5 minutes past 8. "Then, monsieur," said Planchet, "you must buy me a watch." Now, minor tangent at this point. This surprised me. I didn't know they had watches in the 17th century. It turns out they did. The watch was actually invented at the beginning of the 16th century, and by the middle of early part of the 17th century, they had pocket watches. Amazing. I didn't know that. It goes on. "Take this," said Athos, with his usual careless generosity, giving him his own watch. "And be a good lad. Remember, if you talk, if you babble, if you get drunk, you risk your master's head. Who has so much confidence in your fidelity and who's answered for you. But remember also that if by your fault any evil happens to D'Artagnan, I will find you wherever you may be, for the purpose of ripping up your belly." "Oh, monsieur," said Planchet, humiliated by the suspicion and moreover terrified at the calm air of the musketeer. "And I," said Porthos, rolling his large eyes, "remember, I will skin you alive." "Ah, monsieur," said Planchet. "And I," said Aramis, with his soft, melodious voice, "remember that I will roast you on a slow fire like a savage." "Oh, monsieur!" Planchet began weeping. "Oh!" We will not venture to say whether it was from terror created by the threats or from the tenderness at seeing the four friends so closely united. D'Artagnan took his hand. "Ah, see, Planchet," said he, "these gentlemen only say this out of affection for me. But at the bottom, they all like you." "Oh, monsieur," said Planchet, "I will succeed or I will consent to be cut in quarters. And if they do cut me in quarters, be assured that not a morsel of me will speak." It was decided that Planchet should set out the next day at 8 o'clock in the morning, in order, as he had said, that he might during the night learn the letter by heart. He gained just 12 hours by his engagement. He was to be back on the 16th day by 8 o'clock in the evening. And it goes blah, blah, blah. And he goes on to do it. I don't want to spoil you. I recommend you listen to the story. It's really, really good. Or read the story. So I think this is a really interesting exchange. And there are, I want to say, dozens. Yes, there are dozens of examples throughout the Three Musketeers of this attitude to servants. They are really at the mercy. The way they're treated by the musketeers, sometimes from a modern perspective, makes it difficult to like the musketeers. Athos talks about murdering his wife when he found the mark on her shoulder. Again, I won't spoil you. And, you know, it affected him, but this is murdering your wife. I mean, these are 19th century version of 17th century attitudes. So this is really complex. And maybe Alexandre Dumas was over-egging it, but, you know, I think not. I think the thing that we have to remember, whether you're watching a TV show, and I know none of these are particularly historical, but if you're watching something like Outlander, or you're watching something like Vikings, or The Last Kingdom, or it doesn't matter what, or especially something like Rome, set in the Roman era, the attitudes and treatment of those at the bottom of society, whether it was a slave or whether it was a servant or whether it was just a working class person, by their social superiors, was often, by modern eyes, absolutely unbelievably atrocious and abysmal. And you've got to remember that when reading historical sources. But here's the harsh thing. I think we should also remember it when we're trying to portray historical periods as well. I think we do it if we're portraying slavery because there's an investment in portraying slavery as abhorrent. But I think very often when we're watching something like Downton Abbey, we don't see the aristocrats who we want to like treating the servants in the way that servants often would have been treated. So there we go. It's really just to say that. I think that it's good to remind ourselves occasionally that servants, obviously slaves, but also servants and very often just typical working class people, were treated like absolute trash. Not always. Sometimes they were treated well, but they were often treated like absolute trash by their social superiors. Or even if they were treated okay, they were treated and talked to and communicated with in ways that we would find borderline shocking from a modern point of view. What do you think? Do you think I'm wrong? Do you disagree? What TV shows do you think could have been improved by this? I actually think, if a show like Vikings or The Last Kingdom actually gave us a little bit more of a sense of social hierarchy, I think it could actually enrich the story and give new storytelling opportunities and help us see history through different eyes and at different levels. And I think we've flattened the social structure too much in a lot of modern media, and this makes history more vanilla and more boring and more bland, and also doesn't help us understand it any better. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.